I'm Virginia Sapiro. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and a professor of political science, and I'm really delighted to welcome you here to the first annual Gerald and Deanne Gitner Family College of Arts and Sciences lecture. Jerry Gitner of CAS, the class of '66, graduated with a BA in history and was elected to Phi Alpha Theta, the National History Honor Society. He's a trustee emeritus of Boston University and a current member of the CAS Leadership Advisory Board. Gitner is chairman of GL Gitner and Company and chairman of DG Associates, a strategic business consulting group. He and his wife, Deanne, have long been generous and engaged members of the BU community, and we're grateful to him for supporting this. And I'd like you all to turn in that direction and join me in thanking him. Jerry, it's a good thing you're tall, so I figured out where you were. The annual Gitner Family Lecture is designed to highlight current Boston University faculty members whose teaching and research addresses topics of major importance for the broad interest and benefit of the BU community at large, including students, faculty, staff, and alumni. For this very first annual lecture, we've chosen the theme, Advancing the Human Condition, an agenda for research and education. Some of you will immediately recognize this as the mission of the new Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies. But in fact, advancing the human condition is in a very important way the mission of this entire great research university and certainly of the College of Arts and Sciences. Our breadth across the humanities and the social, natural, and computational sciences comes together in our drive to advance the human condition through discovery, teaching, and learning, using every kind of insight our expertise can possibly muster. So our question tonight is this: what do we need to learn? What do we need to know? What do we need to prepare the next generation for advancing the human condition? Because our theme faces the future, we've organized a panel of 6 of our brilliant younger faculty from a diverse set of disciplines to offer their views on the subject in less than 5 minutes each. They knew that already. Our panelists are, in order, Rosella Capella, Assistant Professor of Political Science and expert on national security; Sharon Goldberg, Assistant Professor of Computer Science and expert on cybersecurity; Joe Harris, Assistant Professor of Sociology and expert on global health; Lucy Utira, Assistant Professor of Earth and Environment and expert on carbon cycles and environment; Jeremy Menchik, Assistant Professor of International Studies and expert on religion and politics; and Henrik Selin, Associate Professor of International Relations, International Studies, and expert on environmental policy. So they're going to open by offering some of their own remarks. I'm not going to do further introduction. You have before you a sheet that describes their credentials and expertise a little bit more. And once they have completed those comments, we're going to bring you, the audience members, into the discussion. At that point, we'll have some microphones that travel around, so please indicate you'd like to ask a question. We'll bring you a microphone, and we'll get some engagement here of the whole audience and the panel. And then finally, we will, when my bosses tell me that it's time to make this turn, because I don't have a watch on, we will turn to the 3 senior members of this panel, for each of us to offer very brief remarks drawing together questions and conclusions that we have gleaned and developed during the course of this discussion. So our seniority will weigh on us as having to listen very carefully and decide what we have to say, listening to all of you and listening to our colleagues. The 3 final commentators that we have, and 2 of them I'm very honored to introduce, are Anthony Janetos, the director of the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future and professor of Earth and Environment, and Adil Najam, the dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies, professor of International Studies, and professor of Earth and Environment, and me. So now let's turn to the panelists. Rosella.
Okay. Hi. So when I got asked to participate in this Gitner Lecture, I was equally honored and nervously perplexed. I study war, particularly the economic basis of military power. For example, 2 courses I teach are causes of war and nuclear security. So what was I going to say about advancing the human condition? And I instantly became jealous of anyone studying water or antibiotic-resistant viruses. And particularly water, because I'm from California and it is really bad. So when thinking about what I was going to say tonight, I had to draw on why I studied war in the first place. And I am what you call, or at least I'm going to label myself, what I call a realist optimist. Do I think war can and should be avoided? Absolutely. Do I think war is inevitable? Absolutely not. But I do think war is likely. And war is likely, and we can see that today. Over the past 6 years, President Obama has tried really hard to keep Americans out of conflict, and he's even campaigned on disengagement abroad to nation build at home. And events over the past week has shown us that that's not possible. So given that war is likely, how can we advance the human condition? So here we go, here are my thoughts. I believe we need to study under what conditions states can advance their domestic goals while meeting their international commitments abroad, particularly during wartime. Wars can be moments of opportunity in which political leaders can capitalize on the rally around the flag effect, and they can be moments of opportunity to advance a state's economic and societal institutions. So I want to be clear before I keep going that I'm not advocating for war at all. But I am suggesting, controversially, that if something so atrocious as a war has to happen, is there anything positive that can come out of it? So I'm going to provide some examples, out of some particularly American examples. So out of the American Civil War, we got the national banking system that we see today from the National Banking Act of 1864. And this was particularly important for the American economy because before that time, we had over 1,000 currencies in circulation. We got the Land College Grant Act of 1862 with war as a rationale. These colleges would offer military training. So what happened is the US government gave each state that was eligible either acres of land or land to sell in order to finance their colleges. And one institution we got out of this was Cornell University. Out of World War I, we got the national budgeting system that we see today via the Budgeting and Accounting Act of 1921, which also centralized congressional appropriations. And more importantly, we got the progressive taxation that we see today through the Revenue Act of 1916, and this was carried and made broader to mass progressive taxation during World War II. And in the aftermath of World War II, we got the Employment Act of 1946, creating the Council of Economic Advisors as a goal of full employment after the war. And it is obvious that not all wars result in such institutions. Wars are painful and they are destructive. However, it is worth studying under what conditions wars have been either used to directly or indirectly benefit state and society. Are there ways that states can fight wars, mobilize for wars, or provide for national security that can benefit its citizens in other areas of life? And it is worth noting yesterday that the House, and I think the Senate voted today, the House had a bipartisan vote in favor of training Syrian rebels. Republican representative from Illinois stated, "What would our allies think if we had rejected the president's request?" And this rare moment of bipartisanship that we could all use today to pass policy came out of national security. So what I'm saying is not new. One of the most famous quotes in political science is by this scholar named Charles Tilly that states make wars. I think, however, we have moved away from these types of questions, particularly in the United States. As a country, we don't want to fight wars, and we almost try to hide them from the American public. Thus, policymakers and academics are not looking for ways to advance domestic institutions, but to minimize society's interaction with the war effort. So in sum, we need to study under what conditions states have advanced their domestic goals while meeting their international commitments abroad, particularly during wartime. That's it for me.
Okay, so I study cybersecurity, and I wanted to talk about why I think literacy in computer science and in computer security is important for everyone, not just for computer scientists and so-called geeks. I actually really don't like that word. So I'm going to argue to you that basic computer literacy is becoming essential for everyone in the world we live in now, and I have a few reasons for this. So first of all, let's just talk about ourselves as consumers. So when you go onto a website and you buy something, right? You do some online shopping at Amazon or Target, you go and you put in your credit card on this website, right? What's protecting your credit card? And what's actually happening to protect your credit card? So a lot of savvy consumers, when they look at their browsers, they see this cute little lock in the corner, right? Many of you have probably seen this lock, and you kind of look for the lock. If you're gonna put your credit card in, you should see the lock, and if you know the lock is there, all is good, right? That's sort of, unfortunately, the best we can do as computer security professionals today, give you this little lock. But how many people really understand what that lock means, right? So probably many of you have heard of last year, the Target breach. Maybe people have heard about Target losing a lot of data. If you bought something from Target and you put your credit card into that little box, with the little nice lock in the top corner of your browser, what on earth is happening to cause your credit card to be lost, your credit card number to be lost? The lock was there, right? So, there are a lot of things that are going on when we're storing data, and it turns out that all that lock is doing for you is protecting the transit of your data from the browser itself to the server inside Target's network. And what happened with the Target breach was that someone hacked into the server inside Target's network. So even though the communication between you and the server was secure, it was sitting and stored on that server where it was attacked, right? So it's important to sort of understand, even as consumers, what are the security guarantees you're getting from these websites? What do they actually mean? Another example. So some people have iPhones, and when I got my iPhone, it gave me the option to back up my data on iCloud. Okay, so some of you probably know where I'm going with this. I did not back up my data on iCloud. I did not want iCloud to have my data because I'm a computer security person and I'm paranoid, right? That's my job. So, and so my paranoia paid off, actually. We saw recently that the iCloud servers were breached. And in fact, they were breached as far as we can tell. One of the reasons we think they were breached was because the security of the server was not good. So it wasn't really the user on their phone, it was really inside the Target network. So, it's very interesting, just as consumers, what's happening today is that we have an enormous amount of companies that are relying on your data. They're not in the business of securing their network, they're in the business of selling you shoes or providing you with nice apps, right? But not necessarily securing the data. So security is a cost, but it's also necessary, and this is something that consumers are becoming increasingly aware of. Today, Apple's CEO recently put a release about Apple and privacy and how they do not provide backdoors into their systems to governments and things like this. So this is becoming increasingly important, and I think just as a normal user of computers and of general systems today, this is important to know about. So forgetting about consumers, let's move on. How about as citizens? So an interesting question is, your cell phone can actually track everywhere you go. And there's a trick I can do. If I can show you 5 screens into the menu of your iPhone, you'll find a little map that will actually track everywhere you've been. And if you want, I can come show you this map after the conversation. Is this information private? Well, there was some ruling recently that actually said that it wasn't, right? So you don't really need a warrant to access this information. Sometimes we hear people talking about metadata versus content. What is metadata? Metadata is who I've called, who I've talked to, where I've been, what I've done. And so we are today at a conversation where somehow releasing information about metadata is not as bad as releasing information about content. So you may have heard someone say, no one's sitting there reading your emails, which is true, but they might be checking where your emails are sent, what time they sent, who you sent them to, how frequently you sent information to that person. That's all metadata, right? So if you have a computer science education, you get very excited about metadata because you can learn tons of stuff about metadata. But still, we're having a conversation as a society about metadata somehow being less important than content. And I think basic computer security literacy would sort of shut down a conversation like this, at least in my opinion. And the final thing I want to say, and I guess the last second that I have, is in the policy space. Computer security and computer science is increasingly having an impact on policy. Many of you have heard of potentially the net neutrality controversy that has been ongoing, and was recently, the FCC's comment period was closed yesterday on net neutrality. So there's been a huge outcry from just the general public about making the internet neutral, which means There has been a proposal in the FCC to have 2 lanes of internet service. One is a fast lane and one is a hyper-fast lane. I'm quoting the FCC. So the hyper-fast lane you would pay for, and everybody else would be in the regular fast lane. Okay, so as consumers, we might not get such fast service unless the site we're visiting, let's say Netflix, had paid for the hyper-fast lane, right? And the final thing I wanted to say was one argument I've heard about why we need a hyper-fast lane is the following scenario. You have a pacemaker, and the pacemaker is on the internet. And you really don't want the pacemaker to have a congestion and be slow because somebody's watching Netflix, right? Sounds pretty good, right? So we really need a hyper-fast lane for pacemakers to make sure that Netflix doesn't slow down pacemakers. So this is the kind of argument you hear from policymakers. This sounds really reasonable, okay? I have 2 problems with this argument. First problem, I don't want my pacemaker on the public internet, okay? Second problem, pacemakers are not gonna be huge bandwidth consumers. When you watch a movie, you're getting lots of images, lots of information that congests the network. If you're using a pacemaker, it's not gonna be sending much data at all. So if we're building an internet fast lane for pacemakers, we want this fast lane to be really, really tiny to let these tiny signals for the pacemakers through, and then we can have a huge rest of the internet for everyone else. So again, this is something that comes down to basic literacy on how networks work and how cybersecurity works, and I think that this is increasingly important for everything that affects our lives. And so I hope that I can continue to have lots of people taking my classes and the rest of my colleagues as well, reaching out to a large audience. Even if you don't want to be a computer scientist, I think this information is useful for the general public.
So as a sociologist of global health and development, I have a number of ideas about what pieces of research and education are critical to advancing the human condition. But for the sake of brevity, I'll keep it to just a few. First, research to advance the human condition. Some 5,000 people have now fallen ill in the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. 2,500 have died. And it now affects 5 countries in the region, with the total number of cases projected to grow to between 20,000 and 200,000. It is significant not just to those affected on the ground right now, but also potentially to people in countries around the world that stand to be affected as it spreads. The defense minister of Liberia has stated that it threatens the country's national existence, and President Obama has just ordered the U.S. military to go there to offer help. Extraordinary situations like these provide opportunities for critical research that could meaningfully advance the human condition. Some of the most obvious research would get at the how and why questions. How and why has the response taken the form that it has? How do national and global responses to this outbreak differ from national and global responses to past epidemics, to AIDS, to swine and bird flu? And how and why have some countries enjoyed relative success in the current fight against Ebola while others have met more dismal results? What insights can we learn through comparison? This is something that sociology as a discipline is increasingly concerned with. In fact, the theme of some of the sessions at next year's annual sociology meetings will be, can comparative historical sociology save the world? Okay, so perhaps that's a bit dramatic. But the idea is to figure out what our discipline has to say about major policy issues of the day: terrorism, human rights, failed states, just as an earlier generation of scholars brought insight to the major issues of their time, such as how to avoid fascism. But this is not the only area in which sociology can contribute to the advancement of the human condition, again related to Ebola. We can use sociological insights not only to help us understand variation in national responses to outbreaks, but also to help us understand why disease spreads in the first place. A grave mystery that hangs over the current Ebola outbreak is why so many healthcare workers are dying. Given that healthcare workers have specialized training in how to care for infectious disease, this is a real puzzle. Could it be because this strain of Ebola is more infectious? Well, recently published research has suggested that the virus is mutating, so that's certainly possible. Is it because healthcare workers don't have access to enough or the right kind of protective gear? Well, that's certainly true in some cases, but not in all. Other possible answers that center on more social and cultural explanations are equally, if not more, plausible. Here, insights from organizational and medical sociology direct us away from attributing increased infection to individual human error and lead us to ask illuminating questions about how the culture of hospital organizations may unintentionally contribute to heightened rates of infection. Here we might ask, are safety protocols being followed regularly and correctly? How has deviance from established safety protocols become routine? And in what ways has hospital culture contributed to that? Beyond the bureaucracy, what other cultural customs might be playing a role in heightened transmission? We already know that cultural traditions are playing a huge role in the spread of Ebola among the general population through the cultural practices of washing the dead, consultations of traditional medicine specialists rather than formal healthcare systems, and efforts by families to keep their sick loved ones at home rather than in isolation wards. But how might they be affecting the spread among healthcare workers, who we generally assume to understand these risks? As an aside, if any alumni in the audience are interested in funding the aforementioned research, you can find me here after the talk. Okay, now that I've talked about research to advance the human condition, I want to leave you with a few parting shots about what we can do to advance the human condition in the classroom. Here in teaching voting age adults, I want to suggest that universities have a unique role to play in promoting citizenship and engagement in the world. Why is this important? As of 6 p.m. last Tuesday, just 12.37% of registered voting population in Boston voted in the Massachusetts gubernatorial primary. Many students I teach don't read the newspaper, and I would venture to say most didn't even know the race was going on. Fewer still know what an op-ed is, an important way ordinary citizens can contribute to policy debates. Of those who show interest in international affairs, many are international students, as are most of the students in my globalization class. If we are serious about advancing the human condition, then one of the most critical things to teach our students is to be active and informed participants in local and global affairs. This is, of course, not the only thing that is important to advancing the human condition, but one I believe is critical, and I leave it to my colleagues to offer more.
So I've been thinking for the last 5 days or so about advancing the human condition, and I'm actually not directly going to speak about what I actually study. I think that one of the key things that we need to do is following on the theme of data and data literacy. And as an educator, I think that's one of the most important things that we need to teach. So in our introductory courses to our children and our outreach, it's that data literacy that I think will be key, because there's been an explosion of data. Data is everywhere. You can download it, you know nothing about where it came from, how it was collected, is it comparable to something else, and you can make graphics. Often it's just a headline that you're going to see with a graph, and you look at the graph quickly and you interpret a story. But I think that we really need to be teaching scientific literacy, data literacy, in a way that teaches skepticism and that eliminates fear of numbers, where so many of the undergraduates that come into the freshmen in particular that come into the class, they're afraid of data. They may be very strong in mathematics, but real data is sort of a different problem than mathematics. And that's something that I think that we need to do a better job on as educators, to be teaching that sort of data literacy. And as scientists, we need to do a much better job communicating it and taking data from an abstraction to something that is real, and getting students' hands dirty in data so that they could see what real noise looks like in data and be able to infer real signals out of that. So what I study when I'm not wearing an educator hat and wearing a researcher hat is CO2. And CO2 is it's a funny gas. It's inert. You can't see it, taste it, smell it. You can't. It's just sort of this abstraction. And there's so much passion around the phrase CO2 and climate change, and I say that I study that, and immediately there's a reaction. And in some ways, it's a strong reaction. It's often not a very informed reaction. And CO2 is really actually very simple in what CO2 does for climate. If we didn't have CO2 in our atmosphere, we wouldn't have a habitable planet. It would be an ice ball. And there's no debate about what CO2 does for warming. The debates come around some of feedbacks, how well do our models represent that. And I think that the climate debate is a place where data literacy really comes to a head, because there's a lot of fear that this problem's just too hard. I can't understand this, but we need to be educating our students to really look at this critically. So I just saw a headline yesterday from NASA that August was the warmest August in history, or in the record that we have of directly measured temperature. And I suspect that most people, if you didn't see that headline, would not have guessed that, because it was actually a very cool August here. It was just a very warm August, and on a global average, it was 1 degree warmer in August than, and that what we felt here didn't tell the whole picture. But we need to dig into that data and get away from some of those perceptions that if we have a warm winter or a cool summer, that global climate change isn't happening. And the only way that we're really gonna get over some of those fears is by fears of data and fears of complexity in science, is by taking some of the numbers that underlie that and teaching our students to really dig into it and look at it critically and skeptically and look at the patterns that are there, rather than just assuming that whatever graphic is shown in the Huffington Post or whatever particular media outlet you like tells the whole story. Because if there's a plot that has axes and some sort of time series, it must be real. And that is maybe true and maybe not true. But I think that data literacy and scientific skepticism is something that we really need to do a better job teaching.
Hi. My field is religion and world politics, which is worth explaining. In my field, we use social science research methods to try to explain how religious ideas and religious organizations affect major political outcomes like democracy, war, interfaith tolerance. What that means is that students in my classroom and scholars in my field must be as competent in survey research methods as they are at close readings of the writings of Pope Francis or that of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, that my students read this week. So how can the academic study of religion and world politics advance the human condition? I want to give two answers, and I want to make the case that one of those answers is better than the other one. You can figure out which one it is. The first answer is that we study religion and world politics to reduce religious conflicts, such as the US government's current struggle against ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So my field can help explain why approximately 500 young men from Europe, another 100 from the US, another 150 or so Australians, and overall about 15,000 men from around the world have crossed the globe to fight for ISIS. And what we would say is that these men are part of a transnational movement born in the repressive politics of Saudi Arabia and Egypt in the 1960s and the 70s, where Islamists responded to repression by creating an infrastructure for foreign fighters to join struggles in Afghanistan and Sudan. And that infrastructure has now been bolstered by social media and redirected to Syria and Iraq. So by understanding that infrastructure and the conceptions of citizenship and community that underpin it, we can hopefully reduce the flow of foreign fighters to ISIS. So that's one answer. I think we can do better. A better answer is that we study the ideas of religious leaders to take a step back and see the big picture. BU's most famous scholar in this area, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., warned in a 1967 speech about the, quote, triple evils of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism that can distort U.S. foreign policy. Racism, militarism, and extreme materialism. So let's apply that to the example of ISIS to see if we might be able to see the big picture. The killing of the American journalist James Foley by ISIS prompted President Obama to war, but MLK reminds us that actually ISIS is the wrong problem to solve. The death toll from Syria's civil war is now over 190,000 people. Going to war to avenge the life of James Foley, but not addressing the slaughter of 190,000 civilians is exactly the kind of blind nationalism that MLK warned us about. We study religion and world politics, then, to be reminded that advancing the human condition means ending the Syrian civil war, not just the aspect of it that threatens people with the same passport as us. Similarly, solving the problem of ISIS with drone strikes and arms for a different set of rebels, who, by the way, are fighting the US with US arms, is exactly the kind of militarism that MLK warned us about. So we study religion and world affairs, then, to try to solve the right problem, the problem of establishing legitimate political authority and community in Iraq and Syria, not the wrong problem, which is ISIS. Now, a final point on MLK's third evil, which is materialism. Pope Francis said last fall, quote, "The world has become an idolater of this god called money." It was by far the most provocative and productive thing that scholars of world politics had heard from a world leader in years. And he went on to say, quote, "Men and women have to be at the center of the economic system as God wants, and not money." What Pope Francis is doing there is reminding us that when humans are suffering due to extreme economic inequality, either within countries or between rich and poor countries, or when the weakest in society, the elderly, the uneducated, the poor, the sick, those in prison, when they are hidden away rather than being central to our indicators of progress, we are not advancing the human condition. In other words, we study the words of Pope Francis to be reminded that progress in advancing the human condition must be measured not simply by GDP or by GNP, but by the suffering of the weakest among us. In sum, we study religion and world politics not just to solve religious conflicts. We study it in order to see the big picture. We study it in order to solve the right problem, not the wrong problem. We study it in order to expand our conception of community beyond national borders and beyond passports. We study it in order to expand our indicators of the human condition beyond wealth to the suffering of the weakest among us and use that as an indicator of progress. And finally, we study it in order to ensure that, in trying to advance the human condition, we are not deceived by the triple evils of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Giving a professor 5 minutes is like giving a regular person 30 seconds. But I will do my best here to keep it short and succinct. So of the general theme here of the panel of advancing the human conditions, an agenda for research and education, I will focus on the importance of environmental issues and environmental governance in the longer range future. So I think it's clear now that mainstream economic development since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution have come at great environmental costs. And we, as societies and countries, continue steadily to destroy the ecological basis on which all human life depends, and many sort of critical environmental conditions are deteriorating. So we are in the habit, as Jeremy alluded to, of destroying long-term ecological capital for short-term monetary benefits. And based on current ecological trends, it is clear that it will get worse before it gets better. So with this in the back of our minds, I think that there are at least 2 points I want to make here with respect to environmental issues when it comes to research and education. So on research, I see that there is a great need across various disciplines and universities and research institutes to study how environmental issues and management efforts are connected across different organizational scales, across the global, the regional, the national, and the local. So we have people like me who study global stuff. We have people who study national environmental policy making. We, for instance, focus on the US federal government. We have people who study cities and urban governance, and all of this is sort of important in their own right. But I think what we are increasingly discovering that too much of this work is sort of conducted in isolation of each other, because we are finding out that the drivers of ecological destruction are actually cutting across all of these scales. So whether that is CO2 pollution, whether that is biodiversity loss, whether that is transnational commodity change and consumption, it all goes from the local to the global and then back to the local again. So it's only if we take these sort of extensive connections and linkages across governance scales and start exploring them much more in depth that we can have any chance of trying to advance our research on better environmental governance. And I think this is both about scaling up and scaling down. So it's about taking global policy making and treaty making and following it all the way down to the local level and see how we can use that to afford positive improvements at the local level. It's also about scaling up. It's about taking all the positive developments that is happening at the urban level around CO2 and other climate change issues and see if we can sort of find new ways to get international cooperation around these issues. And here I think it's critical to do more basic academic research, but more importantly, more policy-relevant research and more engaging of public debates. That goes to what some of the other colleagues have said here. Second, on education, I think that we can collectively here at BU do much more to help our students that are interested in environmental issues and take environmental courses to connect dots and see critical connections. And this goes for both undergraduate and graduate students. And I think we need to ask ourselves the tough questions. What would a truly interdisciplinary environmental curriculum for the 21st century look like? Now, more interdisciplinary research is one of the core themes in the BU strategic plans, and I'm not sure how it is sort of being carried out in other parts of the university. But as I look at my own field, environmental policy making, I think we could do a much better job. So here at BU, you can take fantastic environmental courses in the biology department, in the earth and environment department, in sociology department, in history, in the Pardee school, and so forth. But we're largely leaving it to the students themselves to connect the dots. All right, you do biology here. You do environmental economics over there. You do environmental policy making there. But how does all of that actually fit together? And here I would then specifically argue for that we should sit down and see if there is ways that we can offer more interdisciplinary courses taught by 2 or more faculty members. There is still very much a tradition of one professor, one course, and that's how we do it. But if Lucy and I could teach a course together, and Lucy can take care of the science side, very, very competently, I might add, and then I can add, some few things about policy, then students taking that course probably have a better understanding of the science and policy of climate change than if Lucy taught that course herself, or if I taught that course myself. By the way, I am teaching one of those courses. But if I could integrate more with other faculty members, we could give our students a much better understanding of interdisciplinarity. And I think if we do take the BU motto, choosing to be great seriously, I think that involves fostering sort of a better planetary stewardship. That we are teaching students, as Joe was alluding to too, that are sort of active both on a local level and a global level. And if we want to educate environmentally responsible citizen in a truly global, but also extremely unequal and unjust world, we need to find better ways of offering more interdisciplinary courses through Boston University. Thank you.
I'll teach with you next year.
Excellent. The
Thank
dean
you.
will pay for that, right?
There must be something here for you to chew on, surely. I thank all my colleagues here for their preliminary comments. We now have a couple of microphones which are wending their way. While the microphones come over, let me ask you this. Please identify yourself so that the microphone can come to you and we can all hear you, so that there's really time for discussion. And a lot of people, I ask for no speeches. Try to keep your question, say, to 30 seconds or less, and try to make your question have a question mark at the end. And then there might be some response from here or from the rest of the audience, and we should have some good time to mix it up. And then I will be informed when it's time to turn to those of us who have the task of figuring out how to pull it together and be coherent and wrap at the end. So thank you. Please identify yourself, and a microphone will appear.
Thank you. I'm Cynthia Barakat from the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. Thank you all for your comments. One theme I heard come up, especially towards the latter half, was inequality. And it seems to me and we were talking about this yesterday in a seminar that Adil gave and Tony and Henrik participated in. And it seems to me that really is one of the most intractable problems the world faces right now. And I'm wondering if anybody has any ideas, especially since so much of the solutions seem like they'll need to be structural, in what can possibly be done to address this issue when we think about improving the human condition.
I can give it a quick spiel. From a war perspective, obviously wars cause weight inequality, but in the United States, the largest progressive redistributions of wealth we've had were the Civil War, World War I, and World War II in those periods. And if I might answer with a semi-personal answer, I recently got married, and my husband's an officer in the Air Force. Specifically, he's a commander doing force support. And I was shocked by what the Air Force does, and some of the other services other the Air Force is better at this, to promote, to decrease inequality. Subsidized childcare they have, promoting education, especially for those in need. The GI Bill shrunk the middle class after World War II. And again, I'm not making a claim to go to war, but there are cases where we can improve, at least in some domestic institutions, through conflict. I know that's controversial, but.
I'll add my 2 cents. In a world that has grown so small by virtue of globalization, I think that challenges like climate change, challenges like the Ebola outbreak are increasingly requiring richer countries to make the appropriate investments in order to address these major challenges. Liberia's healthcare system is the weakest in the world. And so I think some of these challenges will force the world to step up, and I think that's a sad sort of reality, and that's certainly, I think, not one that we want to rely on, but that is something that I see across a number of different domains.
More questions?
This one's directly for Rosella. I have a question. How do you believe the suspension of the military draft has distanced the American public from its view of war? Or,
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time?
One more time. So the suspension of the military draft, how has that affected American public's view of war? And also, do you believe the absence of common shared military experience among citizens in the United States has promoted a sense of inequality and actual inequality in the United States?
I wish I had a pen. In the first one, I've come around with the draft. I think we are definitely, as I said it before, in a culture where we're denying war is actually happening, right? We haven't had attacks for a war since really Vietnam. And I think not having the draft, which I think we're never going to have again, is part of that. Is part of not having larger conversations about what's actually going on in our military culture. And the second one was, how does the draft relate to inequality?
Yeah, if you were saying earlier that the military has programs to actually promote more economic equality with people serving less in the military across all sectors of our society, how does that affect inequality?
I have not seen any studies on this, but I could imagine where you could see a correlation between not just the draft, but decrease in terms of voluntary service and how that could track related to inequality. So not necessarily the draft, just a shrinking of voluntary service.
Another question?
Hi, my name's Ashley Mears. I'm also an assistant professor in sociology. I have a question that picks up on the point about inequality that's coming from the audience, because many of the speakers made an emphasis about what we could do as educators for our students, but recognizing that our students are among the most privileged of people who are seeking an education in the States and the world. So how could we translate some of these points like interdisciplinarity or data literacy across a broader population that doesn't have access to minds like yours?
Well, one of the things I do in virtually all of my courses is to remind every single student in there that they are the lucky ones. And that they are the fortunate ones, and that not everyone is as lucky and fortunate and have the kind of opportunities that they do. And sort of building off Cynthia's comment too, I don't know how to solve the inequality issue, but I think one of the things we can do is highlight it much, much more. And I think that in a lot of environmental issues, the underlying inequalities are sort of hidden and not always shown a spotlight on. And one of the things we can do as educators is to shine the spotlight on that and have those kinds of discussion in class. And I think that that would translate across most of our disciplines, surely in sociology and history as well. And I think just highlighting it and drumming it over and over, and again, building responsible citizens, maybe we can get something and other people will go out and do wonderful things in the world.
Can I add to that? So as a computer scientist, I've recently been starting to do a lot of work with policymakers. I've been going to Washington a few times a year and talking to people. And I'm actually really surprised to see the technical literacy of people that are making important decisions is not as high as I would like to see it. And I think that the impact of this is impacting everyone. Right, so when we have people, for example, like the net neutrality argument that I made, right? So at least if we just talk about the U.S., just talking about what's going on in the U.S., the internet affects everyone in the U.S. We have a small set of decision makers that are deciding how, the internet is going to be priced in future years that will affect all of us. And we have many of those decision makers not really understanding how the internet works, and this affects everyone. So because we have access to this privileged set of people here in the university that go on to these leadership positions that can then affect everyone in the country, I think it's important that we pass on some of these. I mean, every one of us has our own, soapbox to stand on, and mine is computer science. But I think that there are so many aspects of decision making, lawyers, policymakers, people in government who can impact the whole country. If we can raise the literacy of those people on a few critical issues, I think that can have a positive impact on the whole country and potentially on the rest of the world.
If I can make a last point. In my research, I study Islamic organizations, and the Islamic revival has been one of the most powerful developments of the 21st century, and it's largely happened, for the most part, outside of the state, through people-to-people contacts and influence and social outreach. And it's a nice reminder of the power of people for shaping social norms and cultivating civic virtues, as well as their opposite. And I think maybe we could have a social conversation about greed. Greed is bad, right? I'm going to be a father for the first time in a few months, and I think that's one of the real lessons I want my son to have, that it's not something to be proud of. It's not something to celebrate. I recognize the productive power of capitalism, and right, we all know greed is good, in terms of generating wealth. But there's, I think, a bigger story to tell about the dangers of greed, and maybe add a little shame to conversations about wealth accumulation. Maybe that would be productive.
I could add to that. I think that we could do a lot better at training scientists to communicate. And in our training of scientists, we really focus on the core discipline, the core science, and you really need to have your rigors there. And most of scientific communication is scientists speaking to scientists in technical language that most people would not follow, and particularly in terms of data and data uncertainty and what that means for policymaking and decisions. And I think that we really need to improve our training of scientists to communicate. And I have a lot to learn, but it's not something that's emphasized in our curriculum, and it's not something that's necessarily valued as much as it needs to be among scientists. And that's something that could make a huge impact on how people understand science, how people understand data, how people feel about policies and what policies are made if scientists did a better job communicating. And that's something that we can do at BU. We may be educating the privileged and elite, if you will, because they're going on to get higher degrees. But those are exactly the leaders that we need to teach to be better communicators.
Can I add a second to that? And this goes to something that both Heinrich and Lucy said. I teach nuclear security. And I think where the conversations between science and policymakers really need to have, one area is nuclear security. I teach a section, what I call the breaking bad of nuclear security, where I talk about the inputs of nuclear security and nuclear weapons in terms of how you build one. How do you get nuclear material? And why is that so important? If we are going to have nuclear power, we need to understand the inputs of nuclear power. We need to educate the language of science and to hear from more scientists so we can understand how can we have nuclear power and at the same time not worry about nuclear proliferation. And so that's one interdisciplinary place that I see for myself that needs to have a better communication.
I think we have time for one more question before I turn to Anthony Janetos and then Adil Najam. The person after whom this lecture is named, would you like to ask a question? He's shy.
Here.
I have one.
Here, I'm going to reach over. Sorry.
Make it really good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
No pressure at all. Actually, it was a follow-up on what Jeremy was saying. You had this really compelling, at least to me, argument in terms of greed, and we think about our children and what do we want to teach them, these kind of moral arguments. My question is, how do you then take those moral sentiments and those moral persuasions and turn them into policy? So what would you like to see happen in civil society, or what would you like to see institutionally, either in domestic government or at the transnational level or intergovernmental level? How would you turn this into policy so we can act on some of those ideals?
Keep working, Jeremy.
Sean, Jeremy.
Give me the easy question, right? I'll answer it in two ways. First is again, to sort of push back a little bit. The main engine of social change that I've seen in my work in the Muslim world has not been the state, right? It's been people power. It's been social movements. The Muslim Brotherhood has had their biggest effect, not of the state, they're really not good politicians, but they've changed Egyptian society in very serious ways by talking about ethics and making ethics part of a public conversation. So even though personally, I'm secular, I think there's a place in public education, maybe I'm resolving the tension, in public education and in the public sphere for talking about ethics and ethics education and ways for the state to promote ethical behavior and maybe taking ethics back from the private sphere and bringing it back into the public sphere, and that can be complicated. But there's, the U.S. is actually unusual in having such a sharp division between religion and state, and most democracies around the world are actually much more comfortable with promoting public religious education. Switzerland is the model for that, and it's a religious democracy. So trying to promote ethics, I think, in the public sphere is something we could talk about carefully, but productively.
I'm now going to turn to Tony Janetos, the director of the Pardee Center for the Longer Range Future.
Gina, thank you. I have to confess that I'm a bit overwhelmed by all the statements that we've heard about, and actually grateful to you all for your questions, because I think that's helped sharpen some of the discussion. I want to reflect on several different things, and one actually stems from the title of the center that I direct, the Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, where I suppose the first order of business is to make sure that we have one. The challenge of trying to understand the forces that cause the world to unfold the way it does is really a very serious challenge, and one that does not necessarily respect the departmental divisions of classical academic disciplines. That's a good thing, because the world comes to us as it is. We don't get to pick and choose how problems manifest themselves, whether it's inequality, whether it's the proliferation of unethical behavior, whether it's the sort of specter of extreme militarism or extreme consumerism. But it is important to recognize, I think, that we no longer live in a world where our actions and our decisions, either individually or as part of society's institutions, affect either only ourselves, only our neighbors, only our country. They have truly global effects. And this has actually been true for quite a while. A couple of people have asked me about this tie. It has chili peppers on it. Chili peppers were part of one of the first phenomena of globalization, the Great Columbian Exchange. Now, the biologists and the foodies amongst you will know what I mean. It was the Columbian Exchange that brought chilies to Thailand and enabled the Thai cuisine that we know today, that brought tomatoes to Italy and enabled the Italian cuisine that we know today, and that brought the potato to Ireland. Something tremendously important in Boston, at least. The point I'm making is that while those kinds of phenomena were slow and took decades to unfold, the same sorts of phenomena now, whether they're cultural, environmental, economic, political, religious, take anywhere from minutes to a few years to unfold now. If you think back, for those of you who went through Boston's winter last winter and complained bitterly about how cold it was and how much snow there was, as I did, you won't be comforted to know that that winter was essentially identical climatically to the winters in the early 1970s. That we have already changed the physical environment on which we depend by a whole series of institutional, economic, and consumer choices that we have made globally. And yet, at the same time, we've left billions of people behind on this globe. People who live on less than $1 a day still don't have access to potable water. And these are some of the greatest challenges to advancing the human condition. And I think it's recognizing that both of those phenomena can be true at once. That is part of the challenge that we face, both in research and as educators. I think the last thing that I'll reflect on, which I think is just fascinating to me as essentially a newly minted academic, is the tenor of this conversation has not simply been about the phenomena in the world that we all find interesting. And I will guarantee that those of us of a certain age, that is how we were trained. particularly the scientists. We were trained to study the things that we found interesting because it was good for its own sake. Knowledge for its own sake was important. And yet, all through this panel discussion and your questions, I've heard something different. Not that these phenomena and questions and routes of exploration are not interesting. They are interesting. They're tremendously interesting. But they are also useful. And every single person has tried to emphasize that scholarship that is interesting without being useful is not, in the end, where we need to be. We actually need to have an educational system and educational institutions that enable us to encompass both of those dimensions, if you will, of both scholarship and citizenship. Because I think in many ways, I think that's what we should aspire to in terms of our research and our teaching, is to try to achieve progress on both those dimensions.
So now to Adil Najam, who is specifically charged to advance the human condition as the first Dean of the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you also for reminding me of the enormity of the responsibility that you and others have placed on my shoulders.
Anytime.
I'm Adil Najam, and let me say I am proud to share the stage with the colleagues that I now do. Let me also start with a word of gratitude and maybe a word of complaint. The gratitude, of course, is to the Gitner family for allowing this conversation to happen. The complaint is to the audience, because I have not heard one applause as yet. From Rosella to Henrik, what you have heard is an amazingly profound set of insights, delivered with amazing brevity that us academics usually do not have. So I urge you, please, to take a minute of my time to applaud what is the future of this university and what is a really good future. Okay, don't take too much time out of my 5 minutes. If you go to the website of our new Pardee School of Global Studies, or if you see some of the ads and banners that we have in other places, you will see our attempt to try to figure out and explain to people what we do. Because that's a common question, and it's not an easy question. And to respond to that, we came up with a little haiku, which is on these ads and on the banner. And the haiku in some ways reflects this conversation that you've just heard. And the haiku is, what we do is, we search for peace that lasts, development that works, knowledge that transforms. Now, that's a cute little statement, but behind the cuteness, I hope there is some thought of what the challenge of the future and what the challenge of advancing human progress is. Let me translate that to what I think are three of the great challenges of our times, all three of which my colleagues have highlighted. The first is the challenge of insecurity. Let me argue it's not the challenge of security, it's the challenge of insecurity. And I mean that in a very profound way, but I'll come to that in a minute. It's first the challenge of insecurity, the second is the challenge of humility, and the third is the challenge of citizenship. I say insecurity because we talk about security, but the only time anyone ever really worries about security is when you don't have it. Think for a moment about the last time you thought seriously about your own security. For the crowd in this room, I would imagine the last time was probably the financial crisis, and before that, 9/11. And if you think about what makes people insecure, we suddenly confront this reality that we have to expand it beyond the confines of security as defined by the nation state. That made sense when there was a sovereign. It was a he, it was usually a king, who actually had sovereignty over a piece of land, and that person's sovereignty was the sovereignty, that person's security was the security of that land. I'm trying to sort of very quickly try to point out that as we have moved to the society we need to take security to the human level. We need to answer not just what makes countries insecure, but what makes individuals, humans, insecure. And you start asking that question, and you start coming up with answers that are about water, that are about jobs, that are about dignity at the end. So the first question to me is thinking about insecurity and what makes people insecure in all that we do. The second, when I say humility, is really actually the environmental point that all of my colleagues, many of my colleagues have made, and the subject that I've worked on. Environment, and after having worked on this for nearly a quarter century, I now realize is not just, and certainly it is about carbon, and it is about carbon dioxide, and it's about ecosystems, and it is about species, but ultimately it is a question of human arrogance. And the conflict between our human arrogance, which has come because of our great achievement as a species, and the enormity of the natural environment in which we live. And every time you have a massive snowstorm and the light goes out, think about that question. Every time a flood comes, as there is in the country I come from, Pakistan, as we speak, 700,000 people displaced, you think about that arrogance. I think we are in a struggle at this moment, and we will be for the foreseeable future, between human arrogance and human wisdom. I have no doubt in my mind, especially after this panel, that we have the wisdom to solve these challenges. I am not yet convinced that our arrogance will not get the better of us. And the third is the challenge of citizenship that Jeremy and everyone else talked about. And the challenge of citizenship, and if you would allow me to use the word global citizenship, is not the challenge of doing away with national identities. I still don't know what happened to the Scotland vote today. But it is the challenge of understanding our citizenships as humans and our responsibility as citizens of a planet. And that responsibility is that your action today is going to impact some person who is living in Africa. Just as that person's Ebola can now impact life here for you and me. And I think that is the revenge of globalization, if you will. That the globalization of the disenfranchised is reminding us that the planet is connected in ways that we cannot defy. And therefore, the solution to many of the questions you asked is really thinking about citizenship in that manner. If I can have just a minute to tell one brief story. In 2006, I wrote a book on human security in South Asia. And one of the little numbers that came out of that book has haunted me since then. This is on South Asia. This is a book on security, India, Pakistan. Of course, as I said, I'm from Pakistan. If there's any Indian, there's no political content to what I'm about to say. Here is one of the numbers we found. This was a chapter on water. At that point, 60 years of constant war between India and Pakistan, or constant conflict between India and Pakistan. 60 years of constant conflict between India and Pakistan. Total number of Indians who died in 60 years of constant conflict by the hands of Pakistanis is less than the number of children only who will die in New Delhi only because of dirty water only in 1 year only. The exact same number is true on the Pakistan side for Karachi. Here is the policy problem that confronts me as a scholar and as a researcher. After 25 years of working on these things, being colleagues with my international relations friends, here is what I find. If I'm the mother of one of those children who dies, my child is no less dead whether he dies at the end of a wrong tap or at the end of a gun. As someone who studies international relations, I have no idea really what to do about the gun. I know exactly what to do about the tap. $18.36. $18.36 is the cost of saving one life because of dirty water. That, to me, is the story that brings these three challenges together: the challenge of human insecurity, the challenge of humility, and the challenge of citizenship. Let me end with a word of optimism. Again, listening to my colleagues, I think we have made a turn in our scholarship, in how we take these problems, particularly from this point that nearly everyone has made about the importance of interdisciplinarity. My grandmother was a very, very wise person. Empirical evidence suggests that all grandmothers are wise. Grandfathers, we are not really sure of. Here is one of the things she used to say, and some of you have heard this before. If you point one finger at someone, at least 3 point back at you. And I think that's the challenge for you young folks here. It is too easy to blame governments. Climate change didn't happen because of governments. The debt crisis didn't happen because of governments. Yes, they exacerbated it. Yes, they made bad policy. But at the end of it, there were a lot of citizens who were making wrong decisions, knowing they were making wrong decisions. And even if earlier ones did not, you know that with your emissions. And therefore, I think responsibility begins with the letter I, and therefore, that's the letter that we all need to focus on most of all. Thank you very much.
Conclusion. Note to self. Do not ever again schedule yourself to speak after Dean Najam. Ever. So a couple of little points, a bigger point, and we'll conclude. There was so much here that was fascinating and so much that I would have wanted to pursue. There is one point that I heard again and again, probably most clearly first from Rosella, which is in thinking about how to advance the human condition, we have to be visionary and we have to imagine, but we also have to seek good and solution from what we have. So there were probably some people here who were irritated at best to hear that good comes from war. And we could have named many, many more things, vaccines, all sorts of medicine, all sorts of other things. But part of what was underneath there is we have what we have in our human societies. And when we look around and see the problems that need to be solved, we could throw up our hands and say, oh, this is terrible, we just have to get rid of this, it's bad. And yes, we want to get rid of war. But we have to reach to what we have as a human society and take from it and do what we can. The second thing I heard from a number of people, and perhaps most from Sharon, I didn't actually lose attention after that, it's just I heard these things, is that our conception of what is the just fundamental basic education we need to give at the great university level, the fundamental education, the basic education for people who we will call the educated citizens of tomorrow, is very different from what it was in the past. We cannot listen to people who say, well, you know, everything's changing and education is no good anymore, and when I was a student, this, that, or the other thing. Either the method we had of teaching and learning or the substance we had of teaching and learning. And so that self-reflectiveness, that critical approach we need, and the dialogue that must take place among those of us across generations to listen very carefully about what we carry forward and what needs to be new and what is fundamental now, data, technology, a range of kinds of things, is really critical for us. The bigger point, and here I'm going to speak as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, the platform for the liberal arts and sciences at this great university, is the necessity of search, of discovery, and of connection. And I want to pick up something that Tony said to clarify that we must be useful and so forth, but I'm betting what he doesn't mean is that we pick only the fields that we might regard at first blush of being useful because you can make things, because you can analyze things, because there are data. To be useful is a very, very broad concept. So we heard, for example, from Sharon and others, that people are afraid of data, and they certainly are. But I would also say people are afraid of poetry. They're afraid of, we have people who are afraid of data, I don't understand mathematics, it's all too complicated, or they're just trying to pull the wool over my eyes with the data. Well, you need to learn something about it. You need to learn something about coding now. You need to understand the source of data and how to use it. But poetry, which is also within the liberal arts and sciences, the haiku we heard, that's on the front of the website for the Pardee School, the means that we have used as human beings across culture and time to grasp and to understand and to communicate that which we cannot yet quite put into words, that which we're struggling to understand. And sometimes the only way we can begin to understand is through poetry, painting, fiction, philosophy, reflection. And so when we talk about what is fundamental in an education and what is useful and what is necessary in a world where problems do not come in small packages, in discrete packages, they do come in small packages sometimes, but not discrete packages, what we need to do, and the reason why the liberal arts and sciences is important, the reason why government should be supporting higher education, science, social science, the humanities, and the arts, and the reason why we have to make sure that every one of our students has some fundamentals in the natural sciences, technology, the social sciences, policy sciences, arts, and humanities, is because we don't know where the next piece of knowledge is that we need. We need to connect, as everybody said here, across disciplines, across time, and across levels. And we also need to grapple with those human ways of understanding that we have always had, back to cave paintings, and back to songs, and back to mythology, to struggle to understand at every level we can understand. And so that utility, we happen to have social scientists and scientists and policy scientists for the university. We will include all of those fields, and that we hope that one of the ways of advancing society is that our governments and that our public does not become afraid of poetry, is not afraid of data, does not forsake our need for knowledge in all areas, and is not afraid of those of us who sometimes learn things where they don't quite yet know why that knowledge might be useful. So I thank you. I thank my colleagues. I thank you for coming, and any of you who want to suggest topics for next year, let me know. And I thank Jerry Gitner.